scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her favorite red dress, she noticed that her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late, as if it was trying to catch up with her movements. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like two dark holes in her face. Yet Mummy Pig continued cooking as if nothing had changed. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide across her face. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his favorite dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with the same black eyes as Mummy Pig. When Peppa tried to speak to him, he turned his head toward her with a mechanical clicking sound, his neck rotating far more than it should have been able to. The house itself seemed to be changing around them. The familiar yellow walls were slowly turning a sickly green color, and the cheerful family photos on the walls showed faces that Peppa didn't recognize. The pictures seemed to watch her as she moved through the rooms, their eyes following her every step. When Daddy Pig came down for breakfast, his glasses reflected not the kitchen around them, but something else entirely. In the lenses, Peppa could see a dark forest where twisted trees reached out with branch-like fingers, and strange creatures moved between the shadows. Daddy Pig spoke in his normal voice, but the words that came out made no sense, as if he was speaking in a language that had never existed. The television in the living room turned on by itself, showing what appeared to be their own house, but from the outside. In the broadcast, Peppa could see herself and her family moving around inside, but their movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural like broken puppets. The most terrifying part was that the Peppa on the television was looking directly at the real Peppa, pointing at her through the screen. As the morning progressed, more family members began arriving for what seemed to be a gathering that Peppa couldn't remember planning. Grandpa Pig appeared at the door, but his beard had grown so long it touched the ground, and it seemed to move on its own like it was alive. Grandma Pig's knitting needles clicked rhythmically, but she wasn't knitting anything, just moving them back and forth in a hypnotic pattern. The house began to feel smaller and smaller, as if the walls were slowly closing in. The familiar rooms stretched and warped, with doorways leading to places that shouldn't exist. When Peppa tried to go outside, she found that the front door opened not to their garden, but to an endless corridor lined with mirrors, each one showing a different version of herself, some smiling, some crying, some with the same black eyes as her family. The most frightening moment came when Peppa realized that she was the only one who seemed to notice that anything was wrong. Her family continued their daily routine as if everything was perfectly normal, even as their faces became more distorted and their movements more mechanical. They would turn to look at her with those empty black eyes and smile their too wide smiles, asking her why she looked so worried on such a beautiful day. As the episode reached its climax, Peppa discovered that she could no longer remember what her family was supposed to look like normally. The black-eyed versions had become her reality, and she began to wonder if this was how they had always been, and she was the one who was different. The last scene showed Peppa looking into a mirror, only to see that her own eyes had begun to turn black, and her smile was stretching wider and wider until it reached from ear to ear. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that moved independently. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the smiling faces of her family had been replaced with blank expressions, their eyes completely black. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen, but she stood perfectly still, staring at the wall with those same dark, hollow eyes. When Peppa called out to her, Mummy Pig turned around slowly, her head rotating far more than it should have. Her smile was too wide, stretching beyond normal boundaries, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. George was sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't moving at all. His usual blue shirt had turned a sickly gray color, and when Peppa looked closer, she realized he wasn't breathing. His eyes were the same empty black holes, but tears of thick, dark liquid were streaming down his cheeks in perfect silence. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, but his familiar round belly had become unnaturally distended, pulsing rhythmically as if something was moving inside. His glasses were cracked, and through the broken lenses, Peppa could see that his eyes had been replaced with swirling vortexes of darkness. The house began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls of the kitchen started to peel and rot, revealing writhing masses underneath. The familiar furniture began to melt and reshape itself into twisted, impossible forms. The windows showed not the sunny garden outside, but an endless void of swirling gray mist. Peppa tried to run, but the hallway stretched infinitely in both directions. Every door she opened led to the same room, where her family stood waiting with their terrible smiles and empty eyes. The floorboards beneath her feet began to give way, revealing a bottomless pit filled with whispers. As she fell through the darkness, Peppa could hear the distorted laughter of her family echoing from above. But the worst part wasn't the falling or the darkness. The worst part was the growing realization that she was changing too. When she finally stopped falling, Peppa found herself back in her bedroom, but it wasn't her bedroom anymore. The walls were covered in drawings she didn't remember making, all showing the same scene. A family of pigs with black eyes and two wide smiles, standing in a house being consumed by shadows. And in every single drawing, there was one figure that looked exactly like her, but with a smile that stretched impossibly wide and eyes that were completely empty. As she stared at the drawings, she felt her own face beginning to change, her smile growing wider until she became part of the endless, terrible pattern. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The playground at Peppa's school had always been a place of laughter and joy, but on this particular autumn morning, something felt fundamentally wrong. The swings moved in perfect unison without any wind, their chains creaking in a rhythm that sounded almost like a lullaby. Peppa arrived early, her red boots splashing through puddles that reflected not the gray sky above, but something much darker and deeper. Susie Sheep was already there, standing motionless by the slide, her wool appearing to shimmer with an otherworldly luminescence. When she turned to greet Peppa, her smile was too wide, stretching beyond what should have been physically possible. "Hello, Peppa," she said, but her voice echoed as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Would you like to play a new game today?" The game, Susie explained, was called the Watching. All the children had to do was stand perfectly still and let the playground watch them back. Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat had already joined in, forming a circle around the sandbox. Their eyes had taken on a glassy quality, reflecting light in ways that Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys that usually sat peacefully on their shelves had moved during the night, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. Peppa thought it was just George playing a silly game, but George insisted he had been sleeping all night. The next morning, Mummy Pig found all the family photos turned face down on the mantelpiece. When she flipped them back up, the faces in the pictures had changed. Everyone was smiling, but their eyes were completely black, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig laughed it off as a trick of the light, but Mummy Pig felt a chill run down her spine. That afternoon, while playing in the garden, Peppa noticed their reflections in the pond were moving differently than they were. When she waved her hand, her reflection waved back a few seconds later. When George jumped, his reflection stayed perfectly still, just staring up at them with those same black eyes from the photographs. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but something was terribly wrong. The food on their plates kept changing when they looked away. Carrots became tiny fingers, peas turned into small eyes that blinked slowly, and the gravy moved like it was alive, forming shapes and patterns that spelled out words they couldn't quite read. During bedtime, Peppa heard whispers coming from inside the walls. The voices sounded like her family, but they were saying things backwards, speaking in a language that made her feel dizzy and confused. George started crying, pointing at the corner of their room where a shadow stood. Even though there was nothing there to cast it, the shadow began to grow larger, stretching across the ceiling and down the walls. It moved independently of any light source, reaching toward their beds with long, dark fingers. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they watched their own shadows on the wall begin to move on their own, mimicking the movements of the strange shadow creature. Suddenly, all the toys in their room came to life, but not in a friendly way. Their teddy bears turned their heads to stare at the children with button eyes that had become real, blinking and following their every movement. The toy dinosaur that George loved so much opened its plastic mouth to reveal rows of tiny, sharp teeth. The children ran downstairs to find their parents, but Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting at the kitchen table, perfectly still, with those same black eyes from the photographs. They turned their heads in unison to look at Peppa and George, their smiles too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. The house itself seemed to be changing around them. Doors appeared where walls used to be, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. The stairs multiplied, creating an endless spiral that went up and down simultaneously. The windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but a dark void filled with more shadows reaching toward the glass. As the night grew deeper, Peppa realized that nothing in their world was real anymore. Every familiar object, every beloved toy, every family memory had been replaced by something that only looked the same on the surface. The real question was not how to escape this nightmare, but whether they had ever been real themselves, or if they too were just shadows pretending to be alive. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up to find that something was terribly wrong with her reflection. The mirror in her bedroom showed her usual pink face, but her reflection was smiling when she wasn't. When Peppa frowned, the reflection kept grinning with teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were too precise, too mechanical. She cracked eggs with the exact same motion, stirred the porridge in perfect circles, and when she turned to smile at Peppa, her eyes didn't blink for far too long. George sat at the table, playing with his dinosaur, but the toy's roar sounded different today, deeper, more menacing. At playgroup, Peppa noticed that all her friends were acting strangely. Susie Sheepswell looked darker, almost gray, and when she laughed, it echoed in a way that made Peppa's skin crawl. Pedro Pony's usually cheerful neighing had become a low, unsettling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Even Madame Gazelle's singing had an eerie quality, as if the notes were slightly off-key in a way that hurt to listen to. During playtime, the children gathered in a circle, but instead of their usual games, they began chanting something in a language Peppa didn't recognize. Their voices grew louder and more synchronized, and their eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light. The playground equipment cast shadows that moved independently of the sun, reaching toward Peppa like grasping fingers. When Daddy Pig came to pick her up, his car made sounds it had never made before. Not mechanical noises, but something that sounded almost like breathing. The radio played a song that seemed familiar but wrong, with lyrics that made no sense and a melody that made Peppa feel dizzy. As they drove home, she noticed that the other cars on the road were all identical, all driving in perfect formation, all with drivers who sat too still. Back at home, the house felt different. The walls seemed to pulse gently, as if they were alive, and the family photographs on the mantelpiece showed faces that weren't quite right. In the pictures, everyone was smiling, but their smiles were too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. The eyes in the photographs seemed to follow Peppa as she moved through the room. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Peppa realized that no one had spoken a word since she'd gotten home. They ate in complete silence, their movements perfectly synchronized, their chewing creating a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. When Peppa tried to speak, her voice came out as someone else's, deeper, older, and speaking words she didn't remember thinking. As bedtime approached, Peppa climbed the stairs to her room, but each step seemed to take her further away from where she wanted to go. The hallway stretched longer with every footstep, and the doors to the other rooms had disappeared, leaving only blank walls. Her bedroom door stood at the end of an impossibly long corridor, and when she finally reached it, she found that her reflection was already waiting for her in the mirror, still wearing that sharp-toothed smile. The reflection stepped out of the mirror and took Peppa's place in the bed, while the real Peppa found herself trapped behind the glass, watching as her reflection lived her life. From inside the mirror world, she could see her family continuing their mechanical routines, never noticing that their daughter had been replaced by something that wore her face but had forgotten how to be human. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the curtains, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig called them down for breakfast, her voice echoing strangely through the house. As they walked down the stairs, Peppa noticed something odd about the family photos on the wall. In each picture, their faces seemed to be watching her. At breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper as usual, but when he lowered it to speak, his smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across his face. His eyes had become completely black, like deep holes. George started crying, but instead of tears, thick black liquid dripped from his eyes. Mummy Pig continued cooking, humming a tune that sounded backwards. The television in the corner flickered on by itself, showing static that slowly formed into shapes. Peppa could see shadowy figures moving within the gray noise, reaching toward the screen as if trying to escape. The breakfast table began to shake, and the colorful plates started spinning in circles, faster and faster. Peppa tried to run outside, but when she opened the front door, she found herself back in the kitchen. Every door she tried led back to the same room, where her family sat motionless, their black eyes staring at nothing. The walls began to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs, and the cheerful yellow paint started peeling away. George's favorite dinosaur toy came to life, but its plastic smile had become a row of sharp teeth. It walked across the table on tiny legs, leaving small scratches in the wood. The toy's eyes glowed red as it whispered George's name in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. All the other toys began moving too. The house itself seemed to be changing. The rooms became longer and narrower, stretching like a funhouse mirror. The ceiling grew higher until it disappeared into darkness above. Peppa could hear footsteps coming from upstairs, but when she looked, no one was there. The footsteps got louder and closer. In the garden, the muddy puddles had turned completely black and seemed infinitely deep. When Peppa looked into one, she saw her own reflection, but it was moving independently, mouthing words she couldn't hear. The reflection pointed behind her with a terrified expression. As night fell without warning, the streetlights outside began flickering in a pattern. The other houses on the street appeared empty, with dark windows that looked like hollow eye sockets. The telephone rang with a shrill sound. When Peppa answered, she heard her own voice warning her about something terrible coming. Finally, as Peppa stood alone in the transformed house, she understood that this was no longer her home, and these were no longer her family. The things that looked like Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George turned toward her in perfect unison, their black eyes reflecting no light. They began to speak in harmony, telling her that she would never leave and that tomorrow everything would appear normal.